Pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. So what I'm going to try to do here is give you a sense of the work we've been doing on mindfulness and related to stress, and particularly from an emotion regulation perspective. And then at the end, I'm going to try to tie this work into its application to academics and learning to give you a sense of how this might have value in that domain. So I want to begin by asking you to imagine the brain as a most fabulous Swiss Army knife you can imagine. Lots and lots of tools. And one of our favorite tools, of course, is thinking. And, so we think deep thoughts, we think not so deep thoughts, we make plans, we comment on what it is we think about, and of course we evaluate what it is we think about, whether that's ourselves, other people, our circumstances. And of course, we experience a lot of emotion around the things that we think about. And all that kind of thinking can lead to a lot of stress. And I want to ask, why should we care about stress in the first place? And I probably don't need to tell you this because it's pretty commonly known, but just to give you some sense of it, particularly as it might be related to people in academics or in the workforce, it's certainly known to be a trigger for depression, for anxiety, whether that's symptomology or even disorder, compromised decision-making, memory deficits, relationship conflict. I probably don't need to tell anybody that. Susceptibility to infections, and even things, more profound like exacerbation of disease and cellular aging, where learning and stress can have an impact right down to the level of our DNA. So I want to kind of set the stage here for probably for many of you, just refreshing you on contemporary perspectives on what stress is before we get into how mindfulness might have something to say about that. A very predominant view on stress, it's very much a mind-body process, and it unfolds in interaction between a person and their environment. So in other words, stress is not something out there. It's not something in here. It's very much in the dynamic between who we are and how we approach situations and what situations we encounter. And having said that, though, it's really in here where we have a lot of leverage in terms of choosing what kinds of situations and environments to put ourselves into, and also in terms of how we respond to what it is we encounter. And on that point, there are thought to be two kind of primary appraisals or evaluations, judgments, you could say, we make about what it is we encounter. What Lazarus and Folkman have called, first of all, a primary appraisal, which if it were to be phrased as a question, would be something like, what does this situation mean for me? Which we don't typically get around to asking that because our appraisals are typically so quick. We're appraising things regularly, even constantly, as we go through our day, and very rapidly. It's thought that when we encounter some social object in particular, there's an appraisal being made within the first half second of that encounter. The second kind of appraisal we often make, especially when we do judge something negatively for ourselves or our circumstances, is what can I do about it? And this is where a lot of work has been focused, really, is on coping and on changing how we respond emotionally to situations. So this model here that I put up is a pretty generally accepted model of how emotion gets generated, where there's an encounter with a situation. It could be a person, it could be some event happens, you get pulled over for speeding or whatever. It could be also something internally, like a memory that comes up, or some idea of what might happen in the future. All of that is, say, a situation or a stimulus. We bring our attention to it, and then there's this very, very rapid appraisal of it. And depending on what that appraisal is, whether it's good or bad or neutral, to put it very simply, there's an emotional response. And most of the work that's been done on emotion regulation in particular is really focused here, down here. My light is there. It is. Doesn't really show up there, but way down at the end of the line in terms of changing our responses to situations after they've already arisen. There's also work on so-called reappraisal, re-evaluating, if you like, what it is we encounter. And what we've been interested in is asking, what if you could intervene even earlier than that? Way up here in terms of how people attend to the situations they encounter. What kind of leverage might that have over what follows from that? The appraisals, the emotional responses, and of course the whole host of things that are consequential of those emotional responses. Our relationships, our decision making, our learning and performance, etc. So that brings us to another tool I want to focus on, which we might colloquially call presence. And this is a topic that has been around for a long time and has been of interest to a whole range of cultures and philosophical traditions, East and West. Probably most of us might think of Buddhism as being one tradition that's been very interested in how we use our attention in adaptive ways. But you also see it come up in other traditions as well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about it in the 18th century. William James was very interested in attention and how it could be used adaptively in the 19th century. And today, if we kind of draw that work forward to today into a contemporary neuroscience perspective, we're seeing actually evidence for the kind of ideas these thinkers were writing about over the centuries. This idea that we seem to have two primary ways of processing what it is that we encounter moment to moment, what we might call narrative processing, which many would argue is kind of the default mode of processing, where whatever it is we encounter, it's habitually filtered, if you like, through our appraisals, our evaluations, other ways in which we cognitively manipulate, if you like, what it is we encounter. So if I, for example, see somebody from my life, let's say that I've had a difficult experience with, very, very quickly after encountering that individual, the mind starts working. There's a judgment, there's thoughts about what happened, what's going to happen when I start speaking to them, etc. So it's all this narrative line of processing, and it's called that because this way of processing is very self-oriented. It's very much about me, my story, my goals, etc. The other one, which is the one I want to pay most attention to, is what's been called experiential processing. Sometimes called phenomenological processing. And in contrast to the narrative, its way of working is much more receptive, non-evaluative, if you like, simply observing what's taking place. So it doesn't mean there's an absence of these appraisals and thoughts, but there's a capacity to see that, if you like, to be able to kind of stand apart and see that operating so that we're not hooked by it. So one primary operationalization of this presence or experiential processing is mindfulness. And many definitions of what this is. Here's one that I happen to like from John Teasdale and his colleagues. Mindfulness is associated with being fully present in each moment. When one is mindful, the mind responds afresh to the unique pattern of experience in each moment instead of reacting mindlessly to fragments of a total experience with old, relatively stereotyped, habitual patterns of mind. So that's it's kind of a mouthful, but it really is a way of saying, how can we operate in the world such that we're actually operating upon what's there instead of what we think is there, what we believe is there, what we've learned to associate with different experiences. And it is a topic that probably many of you know has gotten very popular in both the contemporary culture and, to me, one indication of whether a concept is bled into the culture is whether there's a complete idiot's guide to it and a dummy's guide to it. It's of great interest to behavioral science and other researchers these days, particularly in the last decade or so. The amount of work in mindfulness has gone exponential. So if you look at like 2003, on average about one paper a week in mindfulness, whereas as of this, 2013, more like 10 papers a week on average. So it has been associated with and of interest to people who have a whole number of outcomes in mind: enhanced well-being and mental health, better judgment and decision-making, particularly in a risk-related and health-related context. There's also interest in its role in interpersonal relationships and also its place in enhancing physical health. And colleagues and I just published a book on this just earlier this year that covers these and many other topics to kind of get a sense of where the current work is on mindfulness. It's still very much expanding. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with mindfulness, what I thought we could do is kind of give you an experiential taste of it. My sense about mindfulness is something you can talk about all day and not really get it. And kind of like driving in a sense. It's much easier to understand if you can get behind the wheel. So I would like to ask you to indulge me a little bit and to do a little exercise on with working with mindfulness yourself. It's going to be about 90 seconds. And what I'm going to play here is the first portion of something we commonly use in our research to kind of induce or invite people to enter this state of mindfulness. So I'll see how this works with my volume.
First, allow yourself to settle in here by taking a few moments to look around the room. Then settle into a comfortable sitting position, sitting with your back straight against the back of the chair. Your feet flat on the floor, and your hands in your lap. Now, gently close your eyes part way, or all the way, whichever is more comfortable for you. Then ask yourself, what is my experience right now? What am I thinking about? What am I feeling emotionally? What sensations are present in my body? Just observe and acknowledge your experience, whatever it is.
That's just a brief little taste of it, but hopefully enough that you can kind of like get a sense of what it's after. It's not asking us to analyze what's going on, but simply to pay attention to it. And what I want to focus on in particular today is how it can promote emotion regulation. And one of the big interests for us in emotion regulation is because it is such a key underpinning for so many important behavioral outcomes, whether that's behavior regulation or relationships or mental health, physical health. It's a very fundamental process. So the question we've been asking is, okay, how can we enhance that in a way that could potentially be not only very effective, but also very efficient as well? And I want to give you a sense of the kind of methods we use to do this research. We use kind of a trifecta of methods, one being dispositional assessment. We're kind of getting a sense of a person's general capacity to be mindful on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of our work has been based on a measure that my colleague Rich Ryan and I developed very early on in this work. And we've also been using what we might call experiential inductions, where people come into the laboratory and listen to a 10-minute version of what you heard earlier, just a part of, where we then look at the immediate outcomes of that state of mind. And we're also doing work on mindfulness training, various lengths, whether that's multi-day trainings, multi-week trainings, etc. So I'm going to be touching upon some work that uses all three of these methods today. And our guiding proposition is that mindfulness can operate as a form of what's been called attention deployment. In other words, very early after we encounter some situation, and attention is placed on that stimulus, whatever it is, how does the way that we attend make a difference to what happens in terms of the trajectory of the emotional response that results? And one of the key advantages, if in fact this hypothesis bears out that mindfulness is a way of deploying attention, is that when we try to regulate our emotions very early in the process of the generation of an emotion, it doesn't seem to matter very much what intensity of emotion is involved or how impactful the situation is, that when we intervene early, we've just got that much more room to alter the whole emotional trajectory. And in contrast, when we use strategies that target a later stage in the process, let's say when some full-blown emotion has already arisen, whether it's anger or fear or sadness, whatever, the ability to regulate becomes more difficult as the intensity of the emotion increases. So potentially what mindfulness could be is a very efficient way of regulating emotion. And to capture what's going on that early in the process, we really have to look into the brain, because as everybody knows, emotions can be generated very, very quickly. And so we really have to capture what's going on, not just in the first seconds, but even the first milliseconds of our experience after exposure to some stimulus. So I'm going to be talking about two primary kinds of neuroimaging methods, one that uses what's called ERP, or evoked related potentials, which captures what's going on in the brain millisecond by millisecond, and then MRI imaging, which captures what's going on a little longer time span, about 3 to 4 seconds. So where I want to start is by asking about mindful responses to emotional threat, because when it comes to emotion regulation, we are typically interested in regulating both our positive emotions and our negative emotions. So for example, sometimes we have to downplay positive emotions when it's situationally appropriate to do so. But for most of us who are interested in mental health and well-being, it's really the negative emotions that are most relevant when it comes to regulating because of their impact across a wide variety of circumstances. So as I said, this ERP method, it's capturing the electrical activity in the brain as it's unfolding millisecond by millisecond. And I'm going to be focusing on several components of the so-called ERP waveform. So if you can imagine, when you encounter a stimulus, let's say, use that example I gave before, let's say you encounter someone just walking down the hall, your attention turns toward it, the brain responds very quickly, and there are reliable components that can be pulled out of the brain's response that tell you what's going on psychologically. And some of those ERP responses have to do with aspects of the person's attention. They have to do with the person's appraisal of the situation they encounter, and other things as well. So what I'm going to focus on is three components of the event-related potential waveform. One is called the N100, N200, and the so-called late positive potential. In case you're interested, the N here stands for a negative deflection. You can see this downstroke of the electrical activity of the brain. And both of those have to do with attention, how we're using our attention. The so-called late positive potential, it's really kind of misnamed in a sense, because what we call late here is between about half a second to a second. It's simply late in comparison to what's going on at 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds. And I'll explain a little bit more about these components as I get to them. So our primary method for looking at what's going on in terms of our attention and initial appraisals is to put a cap on people that measures the electrocortical activity in the brain, their brain waves essentially, and while exposing them to emotionally provocative stimuli. And so sometimes those stimuli are social in nature, like this example. Sometimes they're non-social in nature. And what we're interested in is the brain's response, the immediate response of the brain to these stimuli that are captured by these sensors. And this first study I'll tell you about used a task where people are exposed to different facial expressions of emotion. And what happens in the study is some of the stimuli represent negative emotions, some of them represent positive emotions. And the task for the person is to respond every time the face comes on the screen. And they're instructed to respond on some of the trials to just the negative facial expressions, on other trials just to the positive facial expressions. So there's always a mix, as you can see here. So respond means a go child, don't respond is what's called here a no-go child. And the interest here is in asking how does the brain respond to positive versus negative emotional stimuli, number one, but secondly, also how do they respond when they have to withhold a response that is in opposition to their tendency, their prepotent tendency to respond. So many people respond quickly and accurately to positive facial stimuli, as you can imagine. And tend to want to withdraw from negative emotional stimuli. And so the question here is, how quickly do people process the information that they see? And secondly, are they able to approach a stimulus, in this case a negative face, that they would otherwise withdraw from? Now the idea behind that, and the reason why that has value, is because there's a lot of situations where we have to do that. As much as we want to withdraw when somebody is angry or sad or afraid or whatever, good social emotion regulation often requires us to move away or in the opposite direction of that tendency, to engage somebody who's angry, or to engage somebody who's afraid, what have you. And so this task is also getting at that ability to pursue social goals effectively, even when the stimuli suggests it's more difficult to do so. Now, of course, our interest was in knowing, how does mindfulness change that? Does it create more efficient processing of social emotional stimuli? And does it help people to approach difficult social stimuli that they would otherwise avoid? So what I'm going to show here are a couple of graphs that illustrate the results. First of all, this bears on the first ERP component called the N100. So this is a deflection of the waveform that comes about 100 milliseconds after a stimulus first appears. And what you can see here on the top are topographic maps of the electrical activity of the brain according to whether people are high, in the middle of range, or low on dispositional mindfulness. And what you can see here is that those who are higher in mindfulness, they show this darker blue coloring, which means a stronger activation of the brain at this point in time, between about 100 and 150 milliseconds. And what this is indexing is a greater ability to pay attention to the stimuli that they're encountering. So that's kind of one indication of how mindfulness may operate, this great ability to take in what's actually going on. Number two is the N200 component. And here again, you can see the top and bottom, the high and low dispositional mindfulness. And down here, you see the difference between the two in terms of the N200 response. And what this is particularly measuring is a person's ability to monitor that conflict that we often feel between the perceived need to engage with, in this case, a negative social stimulus, and the tendency to want to withdraw from it. So this is measuring a person's ability to kind of be aware of that conflict and be able to act in accord with what the situation demands. And what this is indicating is that people who are higher in mindfulness, they show this stronger N200 deflection, okay, which is indexing greater ability to monitor that conflict and act appropriately. What you can see here are in the color bars here, high mindfulness in the pink, low mindfulness in the blue, is just the reaction time to different facial stimuli. Happy faces, fearful faces, neutral faces, and across all three of these kinds of face stimuli, those who are higher in mindfulness show a quicker reaction time. In other words, not only are their brains telling us, yeah, they're engaged here, but their behavioral responses are indicating they're right there with it, regardless of whether it's a positive or a negative stimulus. I will just mention too, this quicker reaction time is not, doesn't come with a sacrifice of accuracy. They're just as accurate in terms of their responding as the people who are lower in mindfulness. So A third component I want to talk about is the late positive potential. And it's a little bit different from the other two in that it's also indexing attention, but it's also starting to get into that point in our generation of emotion where we're starting to appraise something as positive or negative. And so the degree of deflection of this late positive potential is the degree to which the person is kind of going, in a sense, whoa, if it's like a negative stimulus, for example. So what we'd be looking for in the case of mindfulness is actually a smaller response, which would indicate less appraisal of particularly the negative stimuli is what we're going to focus on. So again, people were wired up. They were presented with different stimuli, both pleasant stimuli and unpleasant stimuli, while their brain activity was measured. And what you can see here across the board is that the LPP response was considerably larger, this larger negative deflection to the high arousal stimuli. So these are pictures that have been rated by many, many thousands of people as being particularly impactful. So as you might expect, they're going to be more impactful than those that are low arousal or neutral. But when we take that data and we parse it in terms of whether people are higher and lower in mindfulness, you see a real difference in the deflection. So what you see in the blue are the high mindful folks, the red are the low mindful folks, and there's quite a bit of a difference there. That those who are higher mindfulness, they're just not reacting to the same degree. They're not doing this automatic appraisal of in this case, the unpleasant stimuli that they're encountering. And we were prompted by a reviewer on this paper to look at the pleasant stimuli as well, which we didn't really have much interest in, but it turned out that we saw the same kind of a difference, not quite as strongly, but the same kind of difference between high and low mindful people. And I really had to puzzle about that. Like, why would mindfulness conduce a person to evaluating positive stimuli less strongly? And when we thought about it, we thought, okay, well, what would make theoretical sense is that when you're attentive to something in a way that you're simply taking it in, you're not reacting, then you're not going to be as captured, if you like, by really pleasant stimuli, just as you're not going to be that captured by unpleasant stimuli. So it seems to kind of suggest, anyway, a kind of equanimity, if you like, the ability to kind of like stay even-keeled rather than being moved around a lot by the kinds of stimuli we encounter, whether positive or negative. So now what I want to do is I want to turn to some brain imaging research, in particularly in MRI, but maybe before we get into that, is there anything you would like to jump in and ask about before I go on? Clarification on? Okay. All right, so these two kinds of brain imaging techniques, the ERP approach, the MRI approach, are nicely compatible in that the ERP allows you to get at the temporal unfolding of a response in the brain, and the MRI allows you to know where in the brain is this activation or deactivation happening. The value in that is because there are structures in the brain that have been identified as being related to particular functions, of course. And when it comes to emotion regulation, there are certain structures that have been identified as particularly central to a person's ability to regulate their emotions. So our interest in mindfulness then is like going in and asking, are these parts of the brain showing differential activity according to person's dispositional level of mindfulness or according to whether they get trained in mindfulness or not? So The structure I'm going to focus on in particular is the amygdala, which is buried down way down deep inside of the under the cortex of the brain and the limbic system, and it's known to be of particular value as kind of like a threat detector in the brain. So whether that's physical threat, as would have been very relevant to our ancestors out there in the savannah, but also today, but more so in contemporary society is also social threat. And the brain doesn't really differentiate between the two. The amygdala is activating in response to threat of all kinds. And this part of the brain, if you like, is kind of like a first stage, if you like, in a person's emotional response, particularly if it's a negative stimulus. And what then happens from there is activity in that part of the brain then travels to other parts of the brain that get involved in regulating that emotion. If you like, kind of the amygdala decides, okay, is this something to flee from, to fight? And other parts of the brain then get involved in answering that question, yes or no. So the kind of stimuli that are typically done when you're looking at social threat are, again, emotional expressions. And so these kinds of expressions that you see here are known to activate the amygdala quite reliably when people are sitting in a scanner, or just seem to be hardwired to respond to negative emotions as threatening. A particular interest in the amygdala, too, is not just because it's an indicator of threat reactivity, but also because it's very richly interconnected with other parts of the brain. So what you see here is a kind of a connectivity map of how the amygdala down there is connected to many, many other parts of the brain. So what it's an indication of is just how important our emotional responses are to so many other aspects that are functioning. So this first study I'll just describe to you was done by collaborator of mine, David Cresswell and Baldwin Way and their colleagues. And really it's kind of like a first look at this. And essentially all they did was they just give people a scale of dispositional mindfulness, put them in a scanner, put these images up in front of them and recorded brain activity. And what they found was that their dispositional mindfulness predicted quite significantly lower amygdala activation in that social threat context. And that's a repeat of the same slide, so that's that. And another study that was done by Baldwin Way and David Cresswell and colleagues a few years later showed that not just in response to threat, but even at rest, mindfulness was predicting lower amygdala activation. Now, the value in that is in recognition of the idea that we're not just kind of responsive to threat when it's right in front of us. We also differ in terms of like how chronically vulnerable, if you like, we are to reacting to things that we might encounter. So knowing a person's resting state brain activity can kind of give you some indication of just how vulnerable a person might be to an emotional reaction when something comes up. So knowing that mindfulness seems to be related to this just a lower propensity to respond to threat is quite interesting. Another study was just published a couple of years ago, the same similar group showing that mindfulness was associated with a reduced volume. In other words, the amygdala was just smaller. It's a smaller structure in the brains of people who are more mindful. And to put that in very crude terms, essentially what it means is that that the brain, structures in the brain will, grow or shrink in response to their use. So brain structures that are used more frequently in our day-to-day lives tend to produce more neurons. There's more neural branching, and at a very gross level, they're just bigger. Just more neurons packed in there. So smaller amygdala suggests just less capacity for threat reactivity. So let me then now turn to some mindfulness training research to kind of give you a sense of like, well, okay, how can this capacity, when it's trained into people, change people's emotion regulation capacities? And that kind of work is especially relevant to populations that are already stressed, for whom emotion regulation is a challenge. And so one group that, for whom many are in that category, are those who are unemployed. And so this was a study done with those who were unemployed. I think it was at least 6 months or something. They're all physically healthy. And they were randomized to a brief mindfulness training. It was 3 days of residential intensive training in mindfulness versus 3 days of intensive relaxation training. Now, I can tell you who enjoy their training more. You probably don't have to do much thinking to know that. But it turns out that when it comes to the stuff we were interested in, which was their capacity to regulate their emotions, it looked somewhat different. So the main result I want to tell you about is a linkage in the brain between the amygdala, which we've already seen, and another structure, which is called the Anterior Cingulate Cortex. And there's a particular part of the ACC, and I don't know if you can see it with my pointer. It doesn't seem to show up very well. In case you're interested, it's this structure right here. So this is the corpus callosum, that band of fibers that joins the two hemispheres of the brain. The ACC is all this portion here. And there's one part of the ACC called the subgenual ACC, which is, if you like, kind of the next step along the line. So here's the amygdala kind of ready for its threat detection. Signals from the amygdala then make their way to, among other regions, subgenual ACC. So it's like the first step in a person's emotion regulation. And in fact, it's so early that it's often automatic. So what we're really asking here is, can you change something that is already hardwired in? An automatic pathway. Now, the reason why that pathway is particularly important is because it has really quite significant implications for mental health. So, for example, people who are depressed, you see a very strong linkage between those two structures. It's like Helen Mayberg, who's a neuroscientist at Emory, has put it, is among people who are depressed, it's like the gate is left open and signals can pass through that very freely. So the question is, okay, if you want to encourage more adaptive emotion regulation, can you help to close the gate so that those threat signals aren't passing through so quickly, particularly passing through so much to overwhelm the person? And that's what the training was about, among other questions, was asking that. So this is really getting into the whole realm of neuroplasticity, which probably many, if not all of you, have heard about. It's an idea that's been around for some time, but it's a very kind of revolutionary idea in a sense, because when evidence of the brain's capacity to change in its function, in its structure, as I mentioned, overturned decades and decades of thinking about how the brain works. And so we now know that it doesn't take a lot of the right kind of experience or exposure to a particular situation or training, in this case, to start changing the way the brain functions and even its structure. So what did we see? So people came into the study, they were put in a scanner, they went into this intensive training environment. Remember, it's 3 days. And then they come back a couple of weeks later to the imaging center and get scanned again. So what we saw here was that in these two groups, this is the mindfulness group, health, education, mindfulness. This is the relaxation, health, education, relaxation. And this is the pre-activation, the pre-connectivity, connection between amygdala and ACC connectivity. You can see before training, it's both of these groups are relatively the same, and it's both a positive connectivity, as is typical. After the training, though, you can see a real bifurcation. So here's the relaxation group. Not much change in the connectivity. Still, in fact, a positive connection. Here's the mindfulness group. Significantly reduced connectivity between those two parts of the brain. So what it's suggesting is a capacity to change even the automatic processing of what we encounter. So as much as mindfulness training is about this very kind of volitional working with attention, what we seem to be learning about it is that it can change not only our ability to consciously regulate what we do, say when we're making a decision about something, but it can even change the automatic processing of the brain. All right, so what does that leave us with? Well, I want to suggest that so far anyway, and we're still, I think, pretty early in the game here, is some evidence that mindfulness does seem to operate as an attention mechanism that can help to regulate our emotion by helping us to give this receptive attentiveness to what we encounter in a way that's not overly colored by our valuations or our judgments of what we encounter. And what I want to show you just to finish off this work on emotion regulation is to ask, okay, if that's true, then what we should see is not only evidence at the neural level, we should also see some downstream consequences of that in terms of people's emotional responses. So I just want to show you a little bit of evidence on that as well. And so this is asking about, in particular, biological evidence. So when people have an emotional response, it's happening, of course, at multiple levels, subjectively, neurologically, physiologically, and I'm going to focus on the biological consequences of mindful responses to provocation, and also some evidence on their subjective responses as well. And we're going to present a study that uses a very widely used paradigm that some you may have heard of. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test. Essentially what it involves is a participant, as you see in the front here, before a panel of evaluators, these three people. And the person is asked to give a speech about why they would be a good candidate for a job that has been presented to them. Why would you be a good candidate for a job as whatever, you know, the receptionist in the psychology department or administrative assistant, whatever. And to give them 5 minutes to prepare, they then go in front of this panel who are evaluating them throughout the whole speech. They're giving verbal commentary on how they're doing. none of which is very positive commentary. They're asked, for example, to stay on topic. If they go off topic, they're asked, okay, why is that relevant to this job? Things like that. Then they go immediately into a math task where they have to count backwards by 13s from some random number, like 2,759. And they have to do so as quickly as possible. Again, in front of this panel of evaluators who are telling them to go faster, correcting them every time they make a mistake, in which case they have to start over from the beginning. It's pretty stressful. So, in fact, it reliably activates anxiety and sometimes aggression. It also activates blood pressure, heart rate, cortisol response, you name it. Pretty powerful. In fact, when we were first training our evaluators to do this, I was being the subject, it was like to help them. And even just knowing this was totally set up, it was just helping them to learn how to be a good evaluator, I was getting stressed by it. It just seems to like hook something in us that just hates to be judged by people. But one of the reasons it's used is because it's a very common situation we get into where we're being evaluated by our peers, by those who are in a position to hire us or fire us or be a romantic partner or whatever it is. Social evaluation is very common. And what we were interested in is, okay, how do people differ in terms of their level of mindfulness? And what you can see here is their emotional, first of all, their negative affective responses at different phases of the task. So this is baseline here, where they start relatively low. And then here's the Trier task. It's only 10 minutes. And then they're given all this recovery time in the lab. And we're measuring their emotional responses repeatedly. So what you see here is like, everybody eventually ends up recovering, fortunately. But the people who are higher in mindfulness just don't react to nearly the same degree as those who are lower in mindfulness. This is the control condition where they just do the tasks alone from a tape recorder. You wouldn't expect much response, and you don't get any. We then look at a response within the so-called Hpa Axis, which is one of the primary stress pathways from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal glands from which cortisol gets secreted. Cortisol is known to be a stress hormone, and it can be very adaptive when it's like, you're in a fight or flight situation. You want that kind of response, but when it's more chronically activated, as it is for people who are under chronic stress, say job stress, relationship stress, whatever, it can be very corrosive. It starts eating away at the body's ability to defend itself against disease, for example, and even has mental health consequences as well. So we would like that to be low, to be there when we need it, but to be able to shut off very quickly. So when we look at the cortisol response over the same time span, what you can see here is the same kind of difference. So here's the low mindful people, very typical cortisol response in the Trier. Here's the high mindful people. They respond a little bit, but they recover quite well from that. And there's the control condition. That was difference there. I'll just mention, too, we've since done a study since this was published using a brief mindfulness training, just 4 days, 20 minutes a day, of people working with an exercise at home. Put them in this context, we see a very similar pattern. So again, just to go back to where I started on the value of this, is mindfulness seems to be related to just the lower reactivity to stressors. more adaptive responses to challenging emotions and stress circumstances at neural levels, subjective level, physiological levels. And so it seems to be a potentially really significant psychological resource, we might call it, that people can draw upon when they need to regulate their emotions, and by implication potentially to have positive consequences from what follows from that, in terms of their ability to function well under stress, for example, whether that's in a job situation, an academic situation, a relationship situation. And what I want to end with is to kind of give you some sense of how something like this capacity could have implications for learning, academics. And I'm going to draw from some work that we've done, some work that colleagues and collaborators have done, just to kind of give you a sense of this. We're still very early in the game, but what we're starting to see, I think, is provocative. So turning to students, of course, are just like everybody else under a lot of stress. Their minds are very busy, and that has implications for how they function. So probably many are familiar with the stress consequences of being a student, college in particular, where many students feel overwhelmed. Many times, many students report having felt exhausted. Even 30% of college students have felt at some time too depressed to function, and a significant minority have even seriously considered suicide. So this is not to say that college is somehow worse than any other significant stress that people encounter. There's no question. There's a lot of things that can stress people, but I want to suggest that students' mental health, and by implication, ability to regulate their emotions well, may have powerful implications for their performance in college, and by implication, their academic success. So here's some work that we've done with mindfulness training, the very kind of brief training that we're doing in the lab, just like 10 minutes to see its immediate implications, as well as some longer-term trainings. So some background for this work, particularly on the impact of mindfulness training on cognitive capacity. There's work from a number of folks that has suggested it may have implications for students. Their attention seems to be more efficient, more enhanced executive control of their attention. Also, some work done with military personnel show a buffering of their working memory decline when they're under the stress of basic training. So that kind of served as setup for what might have implications in higher ed. And so we did a study where we brought undergrad students in. We randomized them to one of three conditions: a brief mindfulness training, a distraction condition, where they heard the same recording but just with distracting noise in the background, to kind of simulate what has become a very common urban environment where people are asked to concentrate in the midst of environmental noise. And then a control condition. And we were interested in a couple of things. One is, how could mindfulness conduce to better interest in and enjoyment of a cognitive task? In this case, a very relevant task to college students, which was reading a text that was designed to be neutral in its interest value. So again, trying to simulate the kind of circumstances that students might be under. And we measured it at baseline. We then measured it after the reading. And what we saw here was that those who had gotten the mindfulness training despite the fact they're all reading the same thing, they expressed more interest and enjoyment for what they were reading. They also indicated, based on a free recall task that was done 5 minutes later, after the reading was off the table, they were just sitting for 5 minutes, is they showed better so-called episodic memory. Others, when they're asked to write down, okay, everything you remember from that reading, they were then, their text was encoded for what they did or did remember, which we saw here was significantly better episodic memory amongst mindfulness trainees. What we also saw as well was that training seemed to have its impact on better long-term memory, in part because of their greater interest and enjoyment of what they were reading. I'll turn to a couple of other studies as well to kind of give you a sense of where this work is going. This is a study done by some colleagues at UC San Diego, where they took college students through a 2-week mindfulness training and just brief trainings every day for a couple of weeks. And then they brought them in and sat them down in front of a GRE, some GRE questions, where they were asked to complete them. And what they were interested in is, again, the effect of mindfulness training versus, in this case, a health education and control training around nutrition on several outcomes. The first being their task unrelated thoughts, or TUTs. So this was an indication of whether they were mind wandering, where their minds were going off of the task while they were doing the GRE questions. And what was found from pre to post test is the mindfulness training shows significantly lower mind wandering relative not only to their pre-training levels, but also relative to the control trainees. Also, they just showed better performance on the verbal portion of the GRE amongst the mindful trainees, and better working memory capacity. So what can we do with this? Where can we go from here? Well, I want to suggest there's like all kinds of directions really we could go, because not only because the field is very young, but potentially the implications for this kind of attention training are very numerous, and probably you guys might have ideas that I haven't thought of. But I'll just point out a couple of kind of big picture ideas. And I think one big picture question for me is asking, given that we have these attention capacities that we know can vary a lot and that can be improved through training, what kind of leverage could that offer in terms of our ability to respond adaptively, to respond in ways that are very successful for us in a variety of domains, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and also what kind of applications could be made to those who are particularly having difficulty in domains for which attention is very important, including people who are struggling with emotion regulation, behavior regulation of various kinds. I'll just note here as well a new initiative that is happening on our campus that I mentioned to a couple of you earlier. It's called the College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute. And its mandate is to create a more encompassing, or what might be called a more holistic approach to education, and asking how can we educate students not simply cognitively, traditional academic sense, but in ways that touch upon their emotional education, behavioral education, in ways that may help to set them up not only to be successful in the workforce, but to be successful as a whole person. So this is a very new initiative that has research dimension, course dimensions, and other dimensions that we're still coming up with. And, I bring it up just to potentially open a conversation about what kinds of possibilities there might be for this kind of work and for what folks may be interested in on this campus as well. So these are the folks that have sponsored this work over the years, going back all the way to Canadian postdoc years here, and also the folks have been very involved in collaborating on this work. Colleagues as well as students, past and present. So thank you for your attention.
Great, well, thanks very much. I'm not sure if there's any questions at this stage. It was obviously well detailed and explained, but any comments or questions?
I'm curious, who are the people that can be the most successful, in being mindful, and does it take daily training, weekly, and, how do you have to continue that?
Yeah, it's a kind of an open question. There are many populations that are that researchers, clinicians are training in mindfulness, and there seems to be success across a wide spectrum of healthy adults, healthy teens, kids, and also people with various psychological and medical conditions seem to be benefited by this kind of training. But at least what I'm reading into your question is something I'm also very interested in, which are, can you predict who's going to be most responsive to this training, regardless of what their mental or physical health status is? And that's still very much an open question.
You touched on the high schools, though, and that was my thought, that it might be very effective in high schools where, those kids are still, their minds are still moldable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are people who are doing work with kids in high schools and as young as kindergarten. A very age-appropriate training, of course, but I think you're right. I think kids are not only moldable, but very open. It's fascinating to sit there in like a kindergarten, a grade 1 class, and just watch these kids engage in this. They just dive right in. The college students, stuff we do with college students, adults, like it just needs more setup. Like here's why you should do this thing, even though it's going to feel really weird.
Yeah.
A question, in terms of resources for training opportunities here in the DFW area, do you have any centres or anyone you can refer us to if we want to reach out and go through some kind of training in mindfulness?
I don't know anything off the top of my head. I could certainly look, because there are kind of hubs, if you like, for who's doing what in various parts of the country.
And the follow-up question I had, do you use emotional intelligence? I know that was one of the, about 10, 20 years ago, emotional intelligence training was kind of the focus at one point. And then also you mentioned phenomenological approaches as well. Do you build in other theory sets when you're doing the training to mindfulness? Mm-hmm. Emotional intelligence, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on the training. Some training builds in that piece of it to some extent. So one very common angle, if you like, to mindfulness training with adults is a real emphasis on acceptance or non-judgment of emotional experience. And the idea is that to kind of bypass that tendency that we have to pick and choose our emotional experience. The idea behind encouraging this kind of receptive, non-judgmental approach to what we encounter is a way of encouraging this receptivity to the whole spectrum. When it comes to kids, there is a very quite popular training approach called SEL that you may have heard of, social emotional learning, which has a lot of that, those aspects of emotional intelligence training having to do with not only this encouragement to access our emotional experience, ourselves, but building a capacity to empathize with and feel compassionate for others, other kids, adults, etc. So a really strong emphasis on how training in emotions can facilitate our ability to get along with other people. And that is also a model that has elements of mindfulness in it.
When you were talking about mindfulness and the reduction of amygdala activity, it reminded me of the literature that suggests that the reduced amygdala activity is related to, or is one of the cornerstones of antisocial personality disorders.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that, any like possible negative implications on mindfulness perhaps, or thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think what you're pointing to is this idea that somebody who's sociopathic, they just don't have the kind of emotional threat response, the fear response, that normative populations do. And so that, as much as that seems to be some commonality, we don't see any other commonalities between those populations. So the idea is that as much as the mindful person isn't reacting as strongly in terms of that threat response, they're what the consequence of that is they're more receptive to what they encounter, whereas the person who's more sociopathic is showing a lower threat response and they're just following through with their automatic tendency. See what I'm saying? So even more concretely, what we see socially is people who get some training in mindfulness, not only are they showing like a lower emotional response to other people's distress, but what that then is leading to is greater empathy and more pro-social behavior.
Which is the exact opposite of someone who's
Exactly. Yeah. So we've got a whole series of studies showing that even like a brief mindfulness training, you put people in a situation where they witness someone being victimized, they report being more empathic, but then when they're given opportunity to freely respond to this person, they're acting more pro-socially, a victim. So.